Hello everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this session of the Melbourne Writers' Festival here at Federation Square this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, and pay my respects to their elders and their families, both past and present. My name's Rachel Nordlinger. I'm an Associate Professor in Linguistics at the University of Melbourne, and I'm also the Deputy Director of the university's new research unit for Indigenous language. I'm really pleased to be here tonight on behalf of the University of Melbourne as part of the Writers' Festival, and to welcome you to the 73rd forum in this national series, Just One World, which is sponsored by AusAid, the Australian Government's Agency for International Development, and in partnership with World Vision Australia. These organisations are joined by a university partner in every city, and here in Melbourne it's the University of Melbourne. That's why you have me. So just to give you a little background to this series, One Just World is about providing a platform for ideas and conversations related to important development issues and how these might be addressed. So the idea is to enable you to talk directly with those involved in development, to make your own suggestions and to find out more ways in which you could get involved yourselves. Around the world today, there is still so much poverty, disadvantage and inequality. And as conscientious and caring global citizens, NGOs and individuals often swoop into the developing world to provide assistance, support and relief to the communities that need it. And while many positive outcomes have been achieved in the delivery of aid programs, and there can be no doubting the good intentions of all involved in these, there are also ripple effects which can prove devastating to those communities who are supposed to be benefiting. The people whose culture and language is crucial to their sense of self and sense of identity. The introduction of formal Western-style education, new languages, foods, religions, social structures, and cash economies can bring serious changes to the cultural fabric of communities. Indigenous languages are often put under enormous pressure from more powerful languages like English, and this pressure can lead to language loss, and with it, the loss of thousands of years of stories, histories, and traditions. So to give you some examples, we might find English or another outside language becomes associated with power, progress, and success, and that this can then lead to a negative view of traditional Indigenous languages and cultures. Traditional religion might be substituted with Western ideologies and beliefs. Traditional dress and diet can become outdated as foreign influence sways local style and taste buds. Communities can become divided by changed status, wealth, influence, shifting values, beliefs, and priorities. So how do we know what constitutes positive change in the face of extreme poverty, starvation, and inequality? And how can we ensure that such change is possible without causing languages and beliefs, traditions, and cultures to vanish? Are development and linguistic and cultural diversity mutually exclusive? Or can communities reap the benefits of development while still preserving their linguistic and cultural identity? And what would a world look like without the fascinating wealth of cultural and linguistic diversity that we currently enjoy? As a linguist, let me point out to you that linguistic diversity and multilingualism are a part of the typical human condition. In fact, if you are a monolingual speaker of English, with English as your native and only language, you actually form a part of the overwhelming minority of people in the world. Yes, the minority. So most of the world speaks at least 2 languages, and there are now considerably more second language speakers of English than first language speakers. Human beings are quite capable of learning many languages and operating within different cultures, so it should in principle be possible to achieve development for communities without causing the loss of their traditional languages and cultures. But how can we ensure this? Our panellists tonight will be challenging us as individuals to reflect on these kinds of questions, as well as our own personal obligations as individual Australians towards others in the world who may not be as well off as we are. Now, our focus here tonight is on international development, and therefore on issues outside of Australia. But as Deputy Director for the Research Unit for Indigenous Language, I ask you to remember that many of these same issues we're going to be discussing, especially the fight to maintain and preserve traditional languages and cultures, are actually relevant to our own Indigenous communities here in Australia. So as we consider these important issues tonight and reflect on how we can contribute to a positive outcome for communities, let's also think about how we could achieve this for Indigenous people in our own country as well. So to get this session started, please let me introduce you now to Natasha Mitchell, our moderator for this evening. No stranger to presenting interesting discussion and debate, Natasha hosts the national daily morning show Life Matters on ABC Radio National. She was also the founding presenter and producer of the popular science, psychology and culture radio program on the ABC, All in the Mind. She's had many roles. Most recently, she has been Vice President of the World Federation of Science Journalists. A person of many talents, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Natasha Mitchell.
What a fantastic turnout. It's very exciting that there's so much interest in this subject matter. You know, as Australians, we are generous. We give when countries like Somalia are on the cusp of famine. We give when there's a tsunami in our region. But what are we giving to? And what are we giving for? And what sort of development agenda do we support when our money goes into aid projects around the world? So this is a conversation that's of great relevance to Australia, and of course development happens here on our own shores in all sorts of interesting contexts too. So this sort of dialogue that we're hoping to have tonight is relevant to every little sphere of the world. And I want to just encourage you to use Twitter, if that's your shtick, and the hashtags are #MWF13 for the festival. You can also use #1JW, that's One Just World, for this event as well, but please turn your mobile phones down in volume if that's okay. I'm just totally delighted to have 4 guests here tonight who have worked at the coalface of this conversation that we're going to have tonight. We have His Excellency Mr. Abel Guterres, Timor Leste's ambassador to Australia, to New Zealand, to Fiji, a long-time activist for East Timorese independence, and you achieved it. Abel evacuated to Australia. You might know his story in 1975, and he spent some 20 years raising his children here, driving a bus, driving trams, being an activist on East Timorese independence, and now he's the ambassador. What a great story. And we all, it's a great treat to have educator, social entrepreneur, activist, and anthropologist Butet Manurung. She's the co-founder and director of a group called Sokola, which means school. It's a non-profit focused on providing educational opportunities to marginalised communities across Indonesia. But her story started in the jungles of Sumatra with one community there, and we'll hear about that tonight. It's a story that she tells in her first book called The Jungle School. So welcome indeed to you. And And we also have Dr. Simon Musgrave. He's with the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics at Monash University. He's a linguist. He researches Austronesian languages relevant to the communities that Boutet works with. He researches endangered languages, African languages in Australia, much more. He's also involved in a project some of you might know called the Australian National Corpus Project, which is collecting languages across Australia for researchers. And I'm going to go straight on to introduce Stephen Pollard, 40 years of experience working as an economist in countries across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, the Pacific Islands and South America. He recently retired from the Asian Development Bank and he works as a consultant. Welcome both of those two as well. Well, let's start with a question that Rachel posed for us, and that was, what would the world look like without the current diversity of cultures? Let's start with that question to give us a sense of why culture matters.
It'd be very
Simon.
Boring, yeah. Terribly, terribly boring. I think that one of the major scholars in the field that I work in of worrying about the fate of languages, the American scholar Joshua Fishman, talks a lot about the idea of participating in one culture but in another language. And we need to think about what that means. How integral is language to the culture we belong to? Think of a very local example. What would it mean to shout out, instead of going to the G on Saturday afternoon and shout out, "The man!" if you had to go, "Tanalum, Tanalum," what would that mean to you? It's different. The world would be a different place if we didn't all have our own languages to express our own cultures.
Languages are disappearing, and we'll come to that.
Languages are disappearing, yes.
What that homogenisation means.
Yes.
Boutet,
yes.
What's your take on this? Why does culture matter?
Indonesia, we have so many languages. Yeah, we have 500 languages. So everywhere we go, we hear different languages, and it also stereotypes. So many stereotypes belong to us, and so every time we hear names, just by names, we know how different is this person, and you sometimes treat them differently as well. So cultures and languages will represent and will make the enrich of the world, I think, and that's why we need to preserve that.
Enrich the world.
Yeah, enrich the world.
Abel.
Because when everything just the same, then you don't need, maybe you don't need countries, you don't need states.
I wonder whether
Just
that might make the world a more peaceful place.
Yeah.
I'm afraid,
we just all become the same person.
It's not
I'm
the same
afraid
case.
there's a nice example of that. There's a wonderful website called Ethnologue, which gives you information about the languages of the world, and they have a table there listing an index of linguistic diversity for all the nations of the world. And if you look at it, in the bottom 10 nations for linguistic diversity, you will find Rwanda. That worked really well for them in terms of stopping violence.
To have a diversity of languages.
They don't have diversity of language. They're very homogeneous with language, and they still had interethnic violence. So I don't think looking to homogeneity of language to cause peace is not necessarily a sensible position.
Okay. Abel.
Yep. Having a mono-language all over the world, I think, well, looks like English is dominating everywhere in the world because of the trade and economic interaction between the major countries. But like in Timor Leste, we have over 30 languages. And when you go to the market, people barter. They speak different languages, but in the market, the sign languages, if you got a tapioca exchange for salt, then it's quite fair when one speak with one language, the other receive with the other language, but the object is that salt and tapioca exchange. And so it's a colorful, and I think for us, we really need to strive to preserve those languages, because the diversity within the country gives the color, makes it interesting. Otherwise, it would be boring.
Well, language is only one measure of culture. Cultural diversity has so many other features, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, apart from the language, there are other traditional rituals that come with it. And if, for example, when you have the lisan, which is the traditional laws that has to be imposed on a village or on a sub-district, that is the traditional law that locals do understand. But the traditional law comes with the spiritual power with it. And that's why it's much more powerful to have a traditional law than the law in the books in the city or in the parliament or in the government. Because of this spiritual power that comes with it, makes people fearful and they need to obey it. Otherwise, your spirits will punish you and you get sick. So, in a sense, it is good to have an order like that. Yeah. So, I mean, these are the things that I think cultures and traditions that need to be preserved. But the most important aspect is how in modern day living you join that in a complementary form, that you're not cutting the roots of your culture, which is your identity. Like for us, just to say that why did we fight 24 years not accepting being 27th province of Indonesia? Why? Because of what we are, who we are, and that our cultural identity made us who we are, and we don't want to be enslaved to anyone. And this is why perhaps 500 years of Portuguese colonization, then another 24 years of Indonesian occupation, we finally are free. So what really made people to stand together and fight for what is ideal? And that is your cultural identity. That's what put you together, bring you together as an entity, as a society that as one. And therefore you're prepared to fight to preserve that, and you're prepared to die for it. And that's exactly what happened with us.
I will just ask this though, when you talk about spiritual law in Timor Leste, your country has had to build from the ground up a government, a set of laws. How have spiritual laws meshed with those more kind of formal laws of governance and the like? Have there been tensions there? Definitely.
There are people in remote areas who don't understand the modern law. So you've got Parliament enacting law. They hear about it, but what does it mean? So when there is issues within the society, within the village, whether it's to do with material violence, then people use what we call tarabando. That is the sign that they use with the rituals that will come with it, and you make an announcement of the law that yes, there are these things that you must not do, or whether it is that you're not supposed to let your animal free and go and eat somebody else's garden or something. That is part of the law. Yeah. So that locals do understand. Yeah. I remember as a child we had a ban on coconut. Even though the coconut trees is your own, is on your own backyard, but you're not supposed to take it until the time comes when it's declared free so that you can take it. Even though you won't eat, but if you do it, then what you do is you pay penalty of, for example, if there was a when you enact the law, the Tarabandu, you might slaughter 10 buffaloes. Okay, that 10 buffaloes is to feed the entire village to make the announcement. So that you break the law, you will have to kill 10 buffaloes as a penalty. So who is going to have 10 buffaloes? So that in itself is it's very important to create that order, and that's. But a lot of these things do break down over time, over the occupation. Village uprooted, people went everywhere, and so the normality of village society as a whole was completely interrupted. Yeah. Now we have to rework again. Yeah. And to really preserve the culture, because if a tourist coming from Australia, we don't want our kids to do rap dancing for them. I mean, come on. We have to show what is ours, what is our culture. Let the people from overseas pay the airfares, pay a lot of money to come to see. They want to come to see something different, something exotic.
Well, yeah. Maybe we can get to the a discussion at some point about, you know, some aspects of traditional culture are retrograde, or not very progressive, or sexist, or, you know, there are some problems there. So we might come to that point, because what can we afford to throw out and what do we need to keep when we talk about preserving culture? Stephen Pollard, for you, as an economist, as a development economist, working in our region and beyond, has culture been a big part of your conversations?
Absolutely. It's a fundamental part of the conversations I've held over the last 40 years. To me, there's really fundamental truth, self-evident truth about development. It's really about two things: identity and activity. Knowing who you are, whoever that may be, and why you're here today, what you have to do. And individuals without those two fundamental truths are lost. Societies without those two fundamental truths become lost, which is why I think it can be particularly difficult for isolated societies, nomadic societies, to come to terms with what they see in the rest of the world, modern health systems, education systems, and they have to adapt. And it's a bit of a trade-off sometimes in terms of what they do give up and in order to take up. But for me, it's their decision. And a part of the problem, I would suggest, of international assistance has been the distance to these issues, the distance that they have and have maintained for too long. I'm an economist. I've worked as an economist for 40 years. It pays the bills. But for me, development is fundamentally about people. It's not about monetary economics, fiscal economics, trade, investment, business, and such. And I don't see development organizations having come sufficiently to terms with the best way to assist people and societies taking some very difficult decisions.
Well, where do you see things going wrong? Because one of the issues here is whose agenda are they meeting? Are they meeting their own agenda as a development agency? Are they meeting the agenda of the locals, and how have they established that agenda? What sort of conversation have they had with locals? Where have you seen things go horribly wrong?
I've seen things go horribly wrong many times in many countries. I'd say a fundamental part is just people don't talk. They don't participate. They don't engage in taking a decision. I mean, even tonight we're talking about should we do? Well, it's not really our decision. I mean, the decisions on culture and development must come from the societies themselves, and they must be given the freedom, the space to address the issues in their time and to decide for themselves. We don't always give them that space and that time. Beyond that, I would suggest that a lot of development still tends to focus on the technical and the financial, and is encapsulated within a fiscal year, a budget. And there's such a tremendous turnover of staff in these organizations also. I don't see that lessons have been learned or knowledge has been gained. And there's a political end to it. I mean, we all must know that. Development organizations have their own political economy or their own agenda, their own institutional objectives, and they're not necessarily the objectives of recipient economies. So, some of the work that I've had to do, tried to do more lately, the last few decades in islands, I've been able to do. I mean, I'm grateful that I have been allowed the directions that I have promoted, which is more participatory.
Well, sometimes participation is kind of given lip service, isn't it? It's like, well, we'll
Absolutely.
consult and then we'll do what we want anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't see most organisations, be they bilateral, government, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Europe, US, whatever, or multilateral, World Bank, ADB, I don't see them really questioning their approach. I don't see them looking to outcomes of development and coming back and saying, well, what are we doing wrong? We seem to be repeating many of the same mistakes.
Ted, let's take us inside that jungle,
Yeah.
or jungles, in Sumatra, where you spent many years. You landed there, I think, in 1999?
Yes.
So introduce us to the Indigenous people that you were working with and why you were there.
Mm-hmm. Why was I there? Long story, just when I was a kid, I like Indiana Jones, and I decided to go to the jungle when I was adult, and I stick to that. So being Indiana Jones in the jungle, I accompany them every day and come back again to the language and culture identity. I have the same question again as well. Long time ago, is development will be a benefit to them? But long before that, I also question, do they need it? Because by the time I went to the market with them selling stuff from the forest, and they don't know how to read the scale because they don't know the numbers, they're illiterate, they don't know how to count, and so whatever money they're being given, they will just accept that. But the most sad thing is when people mocking at them, saying that they're uncivilized or primitive or naked or infidel because they don't convert into one of the national religion. So by being mocked for a long time, make them lose their self-esteem, and they don't have pride or confidence to be orang rimba, to be a
So
indigenous
these are the people. They're
yes.
orang
rimba, yeah, means jungle,
so
people of the jungle. So that situation make them believe that being orang rimba is a mistake, and they came to me and asked, why was I born as an orang rimba? Because I said, why? Orang rimba is primitive, blah blah blah, and so I thought, when they're not confident being themselves, how will they preserve their culture? How will they pride to be themselves? And so if you give them some sort of development, they might just accept that, totally accept that, and left their culture behind. Doesn't mean they're really happy with the development, but at the other side, they still want to be orang rimba living in the jungle, but they don't have power, they don't have confidence, because everyone blame them having way of life like that.
Yeah.
So
describe the communities that
yes.
you were living with and working with.
They're nomadic, they're hunter-gatherer, living in the 60,000 hectares of the jungle. Yeah. So you need 1 week to walk from one end to the other one. 3,500 people. Mostly hunter and gatherers, and they have rubber plantation as well, but they don't really commercial benefit from the rubber plantation, because what the most luxury things to them is to have game animal every day, like either python or white boar or lizard, whatever. They think that's the most luxury thing, because they have taboo to eat domesticated animal as well. So this kind of opposite way of life between orang rimba in the jungle and the outside world, which means Muslim dominantly, they have a very contrast way of life. And because they're minority, the dominant always think that they live wrong. And this is the first mission that I have. I want them to be able to enjoy being orang rimba, to be proud of themselves. So that's a long journey.
So one of the threats for those communities were palm oil plantations
yes.
encroaching on their
and
land.
transmigration.
And so you started and this was quite a process. You set up a school.
Yes.
And then you had to recruit some students. And the aim was to teach them numeracy, reading, writing. But you were torn about that, weren't you? There was a tension for you, and you were constantly asking, well, am I doing the right thing?
Yes.
Teaching them these things.
Yeah.
Why?
Because at the first place, when they call a pen is an evil with the spike eyes, and because everyone who being literate always cheating the illiterate people, it comes to my head also, because I also see many indigenous people, especially in Papua or in Timor, giving aid by many aid, and giving development by the state. This mainstream development way of thinking make them change into the direction that they not ready yet, or they're not favor to. Then it's just make them become like a victims, maybe, to be something that they feel strange. And I don't want orang rimba to be like that as well. And so many orang rimba, another orang rimba along the Trans-Sumatran Highway lost their forest and converted into one of the national religion and living in the housing with the four-wall house and go to school dressed up like city people, but they're illiterate and they're never really practicing the religion, the new religion, and they become a beggar in the street.
So they were really distrustful.
So I don't want
they were distrustful of all that, weren't they?
Yeah.
They were distrustful of school. The kids thought the pencils were evil.
Yeah.
They thought that education was potentially dangerous.
Yeah.
So, and yet somehow you stayed connected with them.
Yes.
Why?
Because I've been seeing their daily lives being threatened by the modernization with bringing literacy and many things that involves numeracy and narration. So this it's not making me, but makes some of the students think that to combat outside world, you need to have a tool or a weapon from outside world as well. So, for example, when they have an agreement that they put their thumbprint on it, they don't know how to read, and after 2 weeks, the bulldozer coming in, they didn't know that the agreement was actually saying that they agreed to sell their land. And this is the most scary example that the kids came to me and said, I decided to learn reading and writing even though my parents say no. So we learn in the jungle sneaky, so we hiding our pens and books until these kids really can show the benefit of the literacy.
Well, they were starting to be able to read the contracts that people were asking their families to sign.
Yes.
And I mean, before I come to Simon, I just want to ask, there were interesting tensions, I thought, in some of your work over the years, because the NGO that you were working with had a different thought about how far you should take this work.
Yes.
The foresters had different thoughts. They thought the NGO was holding back the tribal people that you were working with. So there were some real tensions there for you, weren't there?
There are, I think I can say, 3 perspectives of how they view people living in the jungle. Conservative, seeing them as a conservation project, and Orang Rimba should have just become Orang Rimba like a museum. They're not supposed to have anything from the outside world. They need to be just pure. Preserved, like a museum. And another perspective is a modern one. They should have just come out of the jungle, living in a modern people. They have to change like us, whether or not they like it, but this is not that kind of way of life that is nice, something like that. But I want to be able to have this third perspective where they have to be well informed of whatever risk of every development aspect that they want to choose. They need to know the risk of them, the benefit or the, what is the opposite of benefit? The benefit or the drawback?
That's right.
Yeah.
The drawbacks, yes.
Yeah. So when they know about that, they have a consideration, and then they choose to change, stick to one direction or one of the choice, then they, this is like a remote and TV. A conservative will take the remote. I decide whatever you have to watch. But the modern just give the remote. But I want to be able to teach them every channel so they know what they need and what is the not so good to watch and what is the wasting time. So education, I think, is the main key of every communities in the world to be able to cope with the development. So they're not just a follower, but they have a critical thinking of what they need, what kind of life do I want.
So part of education is learning a language, a common language. Simon, endangered languages are a measure of, I guess, loss of culture.
Yes, I think when languages are lost, we do lose substantial portions of a culture. It may be possible to preserve something without the language, but something very important and vital does go with the language. But as a linguist, I think we face the same kind of dilemmas that Steve was talking about. We have to allow communities to make their decisions, and their decisions often are not going to be made on the basis of concerns about language or culture or such matters. They're going to be made on the basis of having a better economic future for their children. That's what people are motivated by in many cases.
Because you'll often go into a community, you're intensely interested in preserving a language that is under threat, but they might not be so interested in preserving that language at all. So who makes that decision to save a language or not?
Well, the community has to make the decision in the end. I know in my experience working in eastern Indonesia, I've worked on a language there that's currently spoken by, well, there's 10 or 12,000 people who know something of the language, 6,000 people who can still speak it well. It's going to vanish. The community is not going to save it, and I can't save it for them. They'd like me to save it for them, but I can't do that because I'm not going to be there 12 months of the year. I'm not going to be working with people every day. And even if I was there every day, I couldn't save the language for them. Saving a language means individual people making the decision to speak that language with their children. And that's not happening in that case.
And is that necessarily a problem? I mean, this is the thing. Can we, when development happens or when cultural change happens, are there some things we can afford to let go of? Sorry.
It's a very, that's a crucial issue.
Isn't it?
And again, it comes down to who's making the decisions. And again, I've had experienced discomfort about the way that we work as linguists, that we are coming in saying, this is valuable, we want to preserve this, we're going to preserve it, we're going to put money into that. And the community might say, well, hang on, if there's some money available, actually, we'd rather have a well, or we'd rather do something else with it. Yeah. And we're saying, no, we think the language is important, so that's what we're spending the money on. Steve, you want to say something?
I was thinking, until you said how difficult it is to preserve a language, I was thinking that it would probably be a good thing if you or somebody did come in and take a record of the language, or the stories, or the songs, the dances, whatever is a part of culture, and probably that blows it out into too great a set of considerations. Because who knows when the future society generations want to come back to that. I mean, before going to ADB in the Philippines, I lived in Hawaii, worked at the East-West Center, and there was a beautiful resurgence of Hawaiian culture, song and dance. I mean, no pure-blood Hawaiians left, but part-blood Hawaiians and Filipinos and Americans, whatever, taking part in this. And they were rebuilding, I felt, from what I could see, their culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's also very important, making a record of what exists, but it's a fundamentally different consideration, I think, from preserving a living culture. apologise, Abel, but even in what you were saying, I felt there's a danger when you're talking about preserving something for the tourists to come and see. It's like saying, well, that's what we're going to keep as this kind of museum that people are interested in, but does it actually have any meaning for people's everyday lives? And it's people making that decision at individual levels that it means something in their individual life.
I think culture is not static. You know, there is always influences. For example, we in '99 we have hundreds of international troops in Timor Leste. They're coming from Africa, Latin America, everywhere. So then you've got this exposure of different cultures. Sometimes within the one department, you've got somebody from Africa telling you, yeah, this is the way you do it. Then you've got an American telling you, no, no, this is the way you do it. So you get this confusion state in terms of addressing the issues. And this is where you said, you know, lost in translation. That's exactly what happened. You got all these aid agencies, they all came in. Many, not all, but many will have come with the idea of one size fits all, regardless of the local culture, local leadership, the way people do things on the ground. Often you just come in and you just, yep, this is how you do it. Then, a few years later, you said, how? It didn't work. Then you know why it didn't work. Yeah. Now, I want to also say, in terms of development, Australians are really generous. You are very generous people. You've helped people all over the world. And us, in Timor-Leste, we benefit from your solidarity and your friendship. What we are saying here is some lessons learned to make sure that your dollar, the money that you give, goes further and really benefit where it is targeted. Now, often the communication issue, so you come in and do something, and then you leave and you go. The locals are not involved, completely. And then because they said, well, that's Malay. That means a foreigner who did it, that's theirs, not ours. But if you get them to do it, they sweat on it, they said, well, this is ours, you know. Who is going to mark it up? You know, and if someone comes trying to undermine it, if there was a water pipe, for example, if someone coming to, you know, break it, and if people in the village who did it, who did the digging and who did all the work, and that's theirs, and you think they would allow anyone to break it? Or if there is in disrepair, they need to repair it because it's theirs. But if somebody else come in, do it and then take off, they said, well, it's not ours. So they take no responsibility for it.
Well, how did Timor-Leste fare? We all knew that, you know, when independence was achieved after the UN had been in place, and that there was this sort of swamping of Timor-Leste with contractors and businesses and multinationals, and, you know, who all had a big global footprint. And there they were, landing on this little new nation, looking for big contracts. Where did that leave locals?
Well, locals were completely disempowered. You have no say in it. You know, often there was arguments, but they win in the end because they've got a dollar. They got a power. Yeah. And for example, there were instances where the local leadership telling people to do the cleaning up as a civic duty, which they've done it before. Now, someone from the UN said, no, don't do it, we pay you to do it. Then every time you tell them, where is the money? No money, we can't do the work. You see how, you know, when people come in, they do something that will give huge negative consequences. Yeah. And to retrieve that, to recuperate that, is going to take time because the masses just follow. You don't pay me, I don't do it. Yeah. Simple. Yeah. And so this is where often local leadership is ignored. Now, in Timor-Leste case, if we had no discipline, if there was no certain order, then why did we resist it for 24 years? why, during that 24-year period, over 200,000 Indonesian civilians living inside the country, not a single Indonesian civilian was killed in reprisal for what the military was doing. This is, you're talking about 250,000 people who were killed, who died. So, in a sense, in a society, there was a certain code of conduct in a society. Yeah. And this is where our friends from abroad often miss. You do not link into the local nuances, local leadership, to make things work because of the discipline that is there. Yeah. Because if you come in from outside, tell them what to do, they say, who the hell are you? Yeah. But if the local who comes in, there was instances where there was fighting, then UN police came in, they still fight. Now, when one of the guerrilla commanders came in, everybody stood. They all stood. They didn't do it. Because of what? Why was that? Because of a sense of leadership and belonging, part of the identity. So this guy is our own. He's telling us what to do, we better stop. If someone else from outside, no.
Too often local leadership is ignored. Right. Steve, I think you wanted to pick up on some points.
Well, I had a question really for the other panelists.
Excellent. Bring it on.
You know, when I first came to the Pacific in 1983 to Kiribati, I was amazed at how strong I felt their culture was. I mean, to me it was unique in stories, in song, in dance, in the houses, the maniaba that they built. And, you know, for some time I was trying to understand how they saw it, you know, I mean, learn about it. And I was left with this sort of feeling that it just is. That's just the way it is. I mean, that's us, that's our culture. And that there was a fear I had that culture was taken for granted. That's the way we speak. Those are the stories that we tell. And they're not necessarily committed to preserving it. I mean, is that a threat for culture and development in the societies where you guys have worked? That, you know, we just take culture for granted. You know, I mean, we're Australians, we dress this way or whatever.
Simon.
I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that in a situation where people just accept culture, that means they're still fully living it. It's the way they see the world, it's the way they participate in the world unself-consciously, and therefore they keep on doing it. But it is also a danger that they are being unself-conscious about it, and if it's under threat, they may not be aware of that.
Yeah.
I know that in my own work I conducted some kind of survey to see how far language was being passed down to children in the communities where I was working, and people were saying, oh yeah, the language is okay, it's doing fine, and I produced numbers that showed that basically kids under the age of 12 knew nothing. Yeah. And people were horrified. They said, how did it get to this? How did we let it get to the stage where we didn't have any idea? So it works both ways.
Well, how did that happen? How does that happen? Is it the homogenising force of a kind of global media now that's entering people's televisions? And
in that community, not so much. They do have televisions. They have Indonesian national television, but they are all being taught. At least nominally, they're being taught Bahasa Indonesia in school. It's a slightly localised variety by the time it gets out there. It's not absolutely standard. I think it's more to do with wanting to be part of wider networks that give greater economic opportunities and greater social opportunities. And people say, well, if I just speak Indonesian at home to my kids, they'll have better opportunities. I think it's really, the point that Rachel raised in her introduction is really important. Most of the world is multilingual, and we need to get the message out to everybody that that's fine. In fact, there's good evidence now that you have cognitive benefits from being multilingual. Children may show some delay in language acquisition because they're dealing with two systems, but in the long term they do fine and they have cognitive benefits, and that's a really important message to get out there. Speak 2 languages, speak 3 languages, yay, we should do it.
Ted, did you want to pick up on something?
Yeah, I agree with Simon, because I think, like in the jungle, they pass the language and tradition orally.
Yes.
So not all of them aware that the culture is getting extinct, yeah. But even just one or two, I think we have to really preserve that. Even just one or two of them realize that this is a big threat. I remember when I was just arrived in the jungle for the first month, like 2 months, one of the mother knows that I can read. They asked me to read everything, newspaper, the wrap of chili they bought from the market, wrapped by the newspaper. They asked me to read it, and they give me so many papers. And then sometimes in the middle of the night they call me. They ask me to write down pantun. Do you know pantun? Pantun is the, you know, like a poetry, like a verse, but have a same rhyme at the end. And this pantun is given to people when you want to ask something. So different pantun, different intention. So every time she remembers something, she call up me. I was sleeping across the river, so I have to cross the river in the middle of the night, and she said, "Butet, hurry up, hurry up. I remember this, write this down." So I write down, and I come back, and like 5 o'clock, "Butet," scream again across the river, "Come back, I remember something else." So I write everything, and it's almost like 200, and she said, "Oh, it's impossible. It's supposed to be 500. And from my grandmother and then into my mother, and now it's just 200. Let me think about something else. We wait, and I fall asleep again, and then suddenly, Butet, wake up, I remember something else. So I wrote down everything, and she said that if I couldn't remember this, and you don't write this down, and my children, they think this pantun is silly, what's gonna happen to all this pantun? And she really sure that if the language is gone, all the culture, all the herbs, traditional knowledge, traditional herbs, they will be all gone too, because they think everything comes from the language. And the pantun is an important part of, especially for the orang rimba. And after 5 years, all the kids realized that how important it is to keep this pantun. So even this mother already passed away, I'm glad that I already write down, because she knows the most.
Yeah.
And now they come to the point when they agree that language is very important.
Simon, I think you've got some things to add about that, that language is the keeper of cultural knowledge that's vital.
Yes. As Butet's saying, there are traditional verses, traditional stories. Even I was going to ask Abel before when he was talking, would it be possible for the people in Timor to continue their traditional law systems without the language that embodies that? Could that be translated into another language?
Now, it's inevitable that some aspects of the culture will disappear. The modern day living pressures do that. You know, naturally that will happen. I give an example of when we have death. In a traditional sense, they usually keep up to a month before burial. That means that during this period, people do awake and they sing special songs that come with it. That doesn't happen anymore. Yeah, because now the coffin is made up of just ordinary wood, not fresh wood, ordinary wood as a coffin. Therefore, the body cannot be preserved longer period. And so that means they have to, within 2-3 days, they have to bury it.
And what's lost?
So that means that that song, the rituals go with it, goes. And that's inevitable. Because people are working, they are working in the city, they cannot come back in the village in time. So this is inevitable.
I often wonder that we think...
I just give you an example. I was in Sydney when my mother died in 2004. So for them to keep her until I get there, I gave them special instructions to go and cut a fresh candle nut tree, fresh, because candle nut is a water-based tree, yeah. So once you make that into coffin, you put the body in and you preserve it, it will stay fresh for however, you can keep up to a month. Yeah. So I took some of my Australians with me. When they got there, they said, wow, 9 days already. And they felt a bit hesitant. I said, come closer, touch the coffin. When they touched the coffin, I said, man, where did they get the ice? There's no electricity? They said, no, it's not ice, it's a fresh tree. That's why it preserves the body. Yeah. But without that, you cannot keep any longer. Yeah. So I think that's just an example. So during the night, they did all the ritual singing. Yeah. But so again, that's why modernity, the pressures, it's inevitable that some aspects of the culture will disappear. Unless, for example, with the songs, unless the state, the government, the state purposefully preserve that, get people to sing and record it and preserve it into the museum, so that the next generation of people, even though there is no practice, but you got some kind of film that people do practice, and at least they can see that aspect of it, even though it's not living anymore. Yeah. So I think that is the pressures of modern day living in terms of pressure on the culture, that certain aspect of it will disappear.
What to hold on to and what to let go of. And I'd like to come to the audience for questions and comments now. But I will just I wonder whether sometimes we clearly sometimes over-romanticise traditional cultures, or we have a sense that they are somehow stagnant or that they should be preserved. Are we at risk of forgetting that culture is an evolving beast?
I was thinking about that in relation to some topics that passed. When you talked about homogenization, we often think about technology as something that's driving that, but actually technology is giving new opportunities. So, for example, communities for small languages which have been dispersed for various reasons, because people have had to leave their home for various reasons, now have virtual communities where they can use their language, they can communicate with people who speak their same language. The language I work on in Eastern Indonesia, there's an expatriate community in the Netherlands. I've seen teenagers in the Netherlands using that language in texting. Similarly, in Australia, we mentioned the possibility of reviving languages after they've disappeared, if there's a record. The poster boy for that in Australia is the Kaurna language, which was the language of the Adelaide Plains, which has been partially revived in the last 20 years. That's being used in texting now as well. So technology does give us not just homogenisation pressures, but also opportunities.
Absolutely. Any thoughts on that idea that we think of culture as a sort of stagnant thing rather than evolved, to be preserved in aspic?
Well, I mean, there are the thread within that. That is the one. That's the one that has to be preserved, because that's the root of the identity of the society. Yeah. Now, whatever comes on the side of it, you can make it flourish, but that thread has to be. Because I cannot say that I'm from a Makassar background, without understanding what is this Makassar is all about. That's my own language. What is that all about? I have to have that understanding. That means it's rituals that go with it. That has to have that understanding. And on side of that, you can do other things, but that is essential. If you cut that, that culture is no longer have the identity in a sense.
It's hard to know what defines that thread, though, isn't it?
Well, there are some aspect of...
Is it continuity?
Yeah, how you do it. How you do it. For example, if there is two people get married, right? There are certain obligations on the wife's family and the husband's family. They have to give something in exchange for each other to align or to link for the two families to come together and link them forever, in a sense. Yeah. I mean, for example, if I was to pay a bridal price to my wife, okay, her family may demand 50 buffaloes. Okay. Now, 50 buffaloes. If I give 50 buffaloes, means I need an equal value of pigs in return, because it's not one way. Yeah. So if they're prepared to give a value of 50 buffaloes in pig or cloth or rice in return, then we do it. So usually, because you cannot do that, you do something symbolic that ties the two together. Yeah, and that's what I call the thread. You need to keep practicing that. You don't have to give 50 buffaloes, but maybe 1 buffalo. It can be in money. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a buffalo.
Did you marry a New Zealander? Did you give a buffalo? Look, I think I might reach out to the audience for questions and comments. I think we have some roving mics, do we? Yes, we do. One there, one there. Feel free to identify yourself if you'd like to. I should just remind you that we're recording tonight's event, just so that you know that. And please, we'd welcome your questions. Shoot your arm up and someone will get to you. And if you keep your questions fairly focused, but we're also aware that there's probably a wealth of experience in this room that we'd like to draw on too. So, yes, I think in the aqua, right there, right bang middle, I think, making it particularly complicated. And pop your hands up and I'll try and remember. There, look, lots of hands going up. Good. Great.
Hi, I'm Rachel. Is it on? Yeah. I just wanted to ask about culture and how it impacts on people's mental health. I know in Western society culture, if, say, traditional people are adopting that, what impact that might have on mental health for individuals. Or I know in the Western society we have ongoing or rising mental health issues, and I think that might be in some ways related to a lack of identity or sense of belonging. So in cultures that are becoming more modernised, do you have any comments on how mental health can be impacted in that, if that makes sense?
Great. Did you hear that? So that was about mental health challenges on the rise in many communities. If we just hold that thought, I might just grab another question while we're at it too. I think there was one over there. Thank you.
Hi. So Stephen mentioned earlier about the participatory approach in development, and I'd like to know what the rest of the panel think about how important it is to incorporate the participatory approach into any development project, and also conversely about the problems with that, because it is well known that you mentioned the tokenism that can happen in participatory projects, and whether they have any methods of combating that. I'm just curious to see what they have to say about it. So.
Yeah, good one. Okay, so participation, did you hear that? How important is it to incorporate participation, and what are some of the problems with that as well? Let's come to the mental health story and the impact perhaps of loss of culture or identity on mental health. Who would like to take that one on?
Well, I think I actually would defer to Rachel probably on this one. There's certainly evidence in Australia that Aboriginal, Indigenous communities where there's been serious break in loss of identity and loss of contact with language and culture, that they have more problems, and where intervention has regenerated the connection with language and culture, that the situation has improved. There's evidence to back that up in Australia.
Any other thoughts there? Rachel, do you want to add anything?
No, that was fine.
Perhaps we can pick up on that theme more closely. Participation.
Don't want me to answer that, do you? I'm a advocate.
You should all answer it.
It's worked for me. You know, I've been very fortunate in my last, 6, 7, 8, 9 years working for the Asian Development Bank to be allowed, to pursue ownership and demand for change and for reform or for improvement of livelihoods, and to do it through a very participatory way.
Have you walked away from projects where people have said, no, actually we don't want this?
No.
Who sets the agenda?
Well, the agenda is set by the people who participate.
Is it?
I mean, and they can come and develop the agenda themselves. We've used, in projects that I had managed, participation to deal with education issues, to deal with solid waste, to deal with the national strategy for Nauru, private sector development, whatever. In a way, it was easier to introduce that approach where society was throwing rocks at each other. I mean, where they'd devolved into a state of very antagonistic state.
Any other thoughts?
No, I just asked Abel what is the question. I couldn't really get it. I mean, participation can be a tricky as well. I think, like in Papua, for example, in 1980s they introduced a soap to replace the grease of the pig that they usually put all over their skin, yeah, to protect themselves from the malaria. And during the forum, no one raised their hand because they think whatever the city people said, that's the best thing for us. And then sometimes after they replace this with soap, many more deaths because malaria more coming in, and then they're confused. They thought, oh, what happened to us? They cannot think that this is because soap cannot protect them from the mosquito bite. And I think participation should be really careful to say that, oh, we collect everything, everyone is already there in the forum and they say yes. And that can be so tricky. Sometimes even all of them say yes, sometimes they just follow the charismatic leader. When he agreed to something, they agree. So it needs a lot of methodology to find out what they really think about participative.
Well, and education is an interesting one, but you being an educator working with remote communities,
yes.
When there's a history of missionary schools going in.
Formal school?
Yep, and missionaries, you know, the kind of religious from the West going in with a particular agenda to educate the people. Did you find that there were sometimes different expectations of what you thought you were educating them in and what the tribal people felt that they needed to be educated about?
Yeah, I cannot say that sometimes that missionary just want to educate, but some missionary wants to educate them, but also in return they need them to be converted into a certain religion, but I really disagree to that. I think education have to be free of any agenda except to be the independence of the student.
Yes. Any other thoughts on participation?
I think participation is really important. If you're coming in to develop certain aspects, you know, whether it's to do with agriculture or education or sanitation issues, you really have to get the locals to participate in it. And the key here is that they need to really understand in their own minds what it is that you want them to do, to adapt. That is the key, you know, because it may contradict what they feel they don't want. So they need to really think that through so that when they accept and the project takes place, no questions asked. Everything flows well. But if you somehow impose, you will have problems.
Isn't there always an element of imposing when, if a project doesn't start with the community, in other words, they define the project, they express a desire for the project. I mean, more often than not, it's, well, you need this, and now we'll work with you to establish how you might need this.
That's right. But often the communities are already collectively understand what they want, whether it's sanitation issue, water supply issue, potable water, drinking water issue, or agriculture development, new seeds, nutritional issue. Often collectively they have an idea that these things will help them in terms of their health issues or having better understanding of what modern living is all about. Yeah. So that if you, once they understood, it's really the key to go forward. I just give you an example. Our Prime Minister, in 1980, our resistance collapsed completely. And our Indonesian, the regime at the time, felt that yes, they had everything in the pocket. Now, Janana Guzman, he went undercover at night time, visit all the camps that our people were concentrated in. Because he for him to take the struggle, the warfare forward, means that more and more people will die. So what he wanted to establish was, are the people prepared to make those sacrifices more and more? He had to ascertain that, to get a certain mandate for him to lead them forward. And that's how he did. Now, during the last few years, where he has, he became Prime Minister in 2007. 2006 crisis, we had 150,000 people displaced in the city in Dili. There was camps everywhere. The World Bank, the IMF, they were all saying, wow, this is going to take at least 10, 15, 20 years to get it fixed. Now, within a year and a half, fixed. Why? It's a local leadership, understanding the people, understanding how they think, what they want, and how you fit your management with that. And it worked. Yes.
I'm sure there's a more complicated story to tell there. Let's come to some questions. Ever the politician, I suspect. Thanks.
Hi. I had a question about, Abel, I think you were talking about the concept of ownership. And looking at culture as a whole, I just wonder, when generations and generations grow up, and children who are not involved with the creation of a culture and do not technically feel they own it, do you feel like it's counterintuitive to continue practicing aspects of culture just for the sake of having culture? Like, I'm a first generation Sri Lankan, and oftentimes I find myself in situations where I'm like, Mom, you know, why are we practicing this ritual? Why are we doing this at the temple? And she'll say, Natasha, it's just the way that is. You know, just move on with your life, you know, don't worry about it. But I often feel quite alienated from my community. So I just wonder, why should we really be holding on to parts of culture just for the sake of having culture and no greater meaning?
Yeah, great question. Can we hold that thought, and I might just come to another question? Let's get a few hands. There's one there. Such a common intergenerational story, isn't it? And we have one there, or where are we? Up the top there? Great. Sorry.
Obviously today we've established the importance of preserving culture, but I just ask how you address certain aspects of culture sensitively, but that kind of need to be changed, like, for example, the oppressive nature of some cultures towards women, like FGM, dowries, and those type of issues.
Great question. Did we get that?
No.
So how do we address, it's great to preserve culture, but what about elements of culture that are oppressive? Like genital mutilation or dowries, or so we'll come back to that. Let's grab one more question if we can. Lots of hands going up now. Fantastic. Where do we start? I'll let you people on the floor drive it.
Actually, I've got a few comments which I'm hoping might elicit a response or two. Development and tradition, they're not always mutually exclusive.
Just speak up if you can.
Development versus tradition aren't always mutually exclusive. In my view, traditions need to change, but they might change more slowly than what we consider modern economic development. Education, we mentioned, is a good thing for economic development. Now, if education is in the mother tongue or the native language, I think you've got two wins there. You can help the community develop as they would like to, plus you're maintaining their culture. Okay, that's enough from me. If any comments on that, please?
Yeah, great, thank you. Let's take one more if we can. Can we remember that? Because there's lots of hands, so it'd be good to get around.
Is there ever a case when intervention to help the culture is appropriate?
Where intervention, give us an example, elaborate a little.
Well, if the culture are doing something that will destroy themselves, should some outside development people come and say, we want to help you, don't understand why, but we just want to do this to preserve your culture?
And that might be the case of endangered languages, perhaps. Let's start with our question here. What are, younger people going, well, why do I need to practice that culture, Mum? That intergenerational tension. Go for it.
I think Natasha will decide. I think your mother may or may not explain, but the future culture for you and your family within Australia is going to be for you to determine.
Yeah. I guess culture means the identity. of the person. So if you are born in Australia, you know, you'll have your daily living is Australia. What Australians do, whether you do football, rugby, or arts, you know, all these things that you are living, you know, here. But it's also the heritage issue of your parents, whether you want to embrace and understand that. Even though you don't live it, but at least you have that understanding of the culture. So when you go back home to the village, you have a fair understanding of how they react to you and how they interact with each other. You've got a fair knowledge. So you fit in without feeling so strange, so alien from them. So I think that's the key, but that's your decision to whether you just want to be an Australian or you want to hold some of the heritage of your parents, to understand that background, where they came from, and how people back in the village are living today. Because I was talking to a friend who is from Italy. After 40 years, he went back. He couldn't believe Italy have changed. Because he came with that culture of back 1960s or you know, something, you know. So again, the culture changes. Yes. So
no pressure.
I think we can relate Natasha's question also to the question about different speeds of development. I mean, it's a known phenomenon that an older generation can become purist about their language and about their culture, and that can cause a breakdown of communication with the younger generation if the older generation don't see that things are developing and that that's the only way forward, actually.
Sorry, I wanted to add to that because I think your question leads to the sort of the battle of development that's going on throughout the Pacific Islands at the moment. The pacing and sequencing of change. It's exceedingly difficult, I think, to live on an island, and it's exceedingly difficult to manage island societies. And they have been pressured for some decades now to take on board certain reforms, including economic reforms. And there's just so much, that their society and the political pressures that are brought to them through that society will understand at any one time, will accept at any one time, and if you pursue the reform too fast, then you're out of government. And I think that's a particular problem in Timor Leste in terms of pulling all the people into understanding what might be going on only in Dili.
I think in the development issues is the expectation that is so high. When people donate money for the development, they expect that society, you want them to quickly become like you, when it's not. You are addressing layers of development that will take time to build. Just see this. The Europeans, until last centuries, they were at each other's throat, killing each other. War, isn't it? And took them all this time to come to where they are now, that no more warfare, right? So again, everything takes time to build, yes. Even within the society where children or young people, they're hot blood, they want to get on a plane and fly quickly. But the thing is, if you got no airport, how the hell are you going to have an airplane to fly? So again, it takes time to build and lower the expectation, because it takes time. It takes time to people to understand and go through the process. Because, like for us, we cannot develop without peace and security. So no peace, no security, development cannot take place. Foreign investors cannot come in because they'll be too scared to come and put their money in.
Well, and one of the great tensions, I thought that was a great question up there about, well, what about elements of tradition that are oppressive or retrograde? Do you have a thought about that?
I just give an example. One of the schools that our organization provided is in Halmahera in Maluku, and this community have an incest tradition. So mother married the son, and brothers fighting for for their sister, things like that, and they still have a war among another. And at the beginning, I thought this is such a scary community, and then I realized the more a community different to us, the more we feel insecure, or the more very different, they're strange. And then after several days, I some kind of understand about why they do this incest. I think every element of the culture have a logical reason of why they do that, and like this community who is doing incest, that
logical?
Is because...
Is it always logical?
Logical
or is it historical?
Logical is contextual. Logical is contextual, yeah. Logical to them means because they have a war, they have a territorial, they don't want their part of their community married to this community, so then they are so isolated, then they become a internal marriage, and that becomes the incest. So, of course, some of them not born very healthy, and that's part of the mortality control. And because they don't have contraception as well, a lot of birthing, a lot of mortality. That's just a reason. That's something that I think before we judge one community is very repressive, we have to understand what is the reason behind why they're doing that. Papua also have so many wars among themselves, yeah. But people like Orang Rimba, they're so peaceful. They cannot even hit their kids. They will get fined. They cannot yell at their kids. They will get fined. So I think everything has a reason, logical to them.
So what about this question that was also asked about when, as an outsider, you go, well, I know what's best for you. You're about to risk something. You're about to lose something that you will regret losing. So I'm going to impose a process on you to help you save it. Any thoughts on that before I come to another question?
As a linguist, I think I would say, go back to the point that Steve made, that we should document, but I don't see that we can make interventions on other people's behalf. I think if the community doesn't see that they're about to lose their language and they're not motivated, therefore, to do anything, I don't see that there's anything I can do that will actually change that situation.
Other than give information.
Other than give information. It has to be individual people making decisions to use the language to find functional domains for their language and their culture that will preserve it. I don't think I can do that for them.
Yep, I mean, cultural change, it's inevitable. You know, the role of women, the role of men, gender equality, is at least we are embracing as a society. We're embracing this gender equality, and it's quite good because we have 37% women representation in our parliament, different to all the Pacific countries, even Australia. So that is already something. It's a change, positive change for us. Yeah.
Let's cut. That's a development and a half, isn't it? Let's come to some more questions. We've got a few more minutes left. So we've got one at the front here. Go for it.
Oh, hello there.
Oh, where are we?
I'm here. Oh, sorry.
Where are we?
Yeah.
Hey.
Okay, great. Okay. Yep, go.
I'm an Aussie who only speaks English, and my sort of question comes with sort of grammar school and sort of learning. Sort of, okay, you have
just
a choice.
Just talk right onto the mic if you can.
So,
thanks.
okay, they can hear me now?
Yep.
My question comes from so being Aussie and speaking only English, and then coming on to grammar school is okay, you have a choice, kids, you're going to learn French. And it goes through extensive grammar. And you go, okay, kids, you're going to have exam on this. Okay, come on. And there's no fun in it. And so with people who speak in a language, I think, oh, wow, they're so fantastic, they're so happy, and they speak this amazing language, which you might not get from grammar school in Australia. Or maybe that's just French. Okay, so.
Okay. You have a question, or is that more a comment?
So, yeah, I was so sorry.
More a
concept of teaching a language, and so, okay, we're learning it this way because that's how it's always done, or a holistic approach. Okay, kids, this is so fun, it's so fantastic for you, a new experience.
Okay.
Is that more explaining?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, okay. We'll come to that about, I mean, maybe inspiring people to learn languages that, you know, it's a process of fun rather than torture. Yes, we had another question here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I was just wondering, could you guys talk a bit more about the role of Western media in diminishing cultural diversity and stereotyping, which then leads to, I guess, the loss of different cultural identities. For example, my background is Indian, and a lot of people just think that, like, there's one Indian race or one Indian group of people, or there's just an Indian language. Like, my friends like, oh, do you speak Indian? But there's no, like, the Indian language doesn't exist. There's almost 200 different languages in India. So yeah, but then you've got like The Simpsons, where they represent Apu, and yeah, it just diminishes that cultural diversity. And also with what Batet was saying about the community that practices incest, a lot of people, they frown upon incest in the Western world, but forgetting the fact that in medieval Europe, a lot of kings would marry, if they had a daughter, they would marry their daughter to their brother's son in order to make sure their dynasty continued. And this was happening in medieval England, in medieval France, medieval Spain. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Great question about the Western media. Let's grab a couple more if we can. Hold that thought. Language, media. Where are we? You have to just let me know. Thank you. Great. And then we'll work our way up to the back too.
Hi, I wanted to push back on some of the conversation around participation by introducing another concept which has been noticeably, from my opinion anyways, absent from this conversation, and that's of rights. I think especially within the development sector, we talk so much about participation, which is not an obligatory gesture. It happens when banks or companies want to be participative or inclusive, but it's not a necessity. And I suppose the question then is, what's the role of rights in development, especially, as I think has been talked about a little bit, the right to autonomy and self-determination?
And we'll get one more question if we can. Oh, where can we go? Let's go right at the back. Thank you. Yep.
Oh. Yes, I'm just, I want to speak in regard to the connection between spirituality and language. I was privileged to hear an interview with a linguist who'd worked in the Flinders Ranges area, which is, if you don't know it, in South Australia, and it has the highest mammalian extinction of any place in the world. They interviewed two elders from a tribe who had been relocated to a mission in Ceduna for several decades. So they lost the connection with the land. The woman was, the female elder was upset because of the fact that she'd named, not only she birthed her children in a hospital, but she'd also hadn't been able to name them properly.
Can you focus it a little bit for us? Thanks.
But she hadn't been able to, she hadn't been able to name them properly because they weren't connected to the land. They hadn't been born in the land, so, and they're named onomatopoeically in regard to the terrain of the area.
Okay.
The second one was of an elder male who, when he was presented with the skin of a bilby or a numbat, whatever, one of those many animals had gone extinct, he said that it was his brother, and that he had forgotten the song, and he did not know how to sing it, and he did not know the pitch to sing it in.
Okay.
So the animal had gone extinct.
Thank you very much. Someone's really itching to ask a question down here. We might get you, but we do have to wrap. So we have quite a lot there. Let's start with Western media, and then let's come to the question of rights. Go for it. Who would like to take on the concern about the kind of homogenising force of Western media across the world? One of you.
I was hoping one of you would.
One of you can volunteer, and then I'll go to the next question.
It certainly resonated with me what the questioner said when talking about Indian as language. So one of the areas I've done research on is the Sudanese community in Australia. And you regularly see references to Sudanese as a language, and it doesn't exist. In fact, our research has shown that in the community in Melbourne there's at least 30 languages represented, and that is completely invisible as far as the media are concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's consider rights to rap. Rights is enormous.
Yes.
And I feel like it's a crucial question, and it's a big one to end on, but let's address that question in whatever way you'd like to.
If I could.
About the role of rights.
For me, the two go together. And something that I think that we forget, a lot of countries we've been talking about today are sort of relatively newly independent. And not only, I would suggest, pardon me, not only I feel as Timor Leste sort of losing out in terms of some of the cultural attributes in rural areas or more generally, but also in terms of social relations, in terms of governance, in terms of interaction, in terms of political system. And I see that all the way through the Pacific Islands. And why I believe in participation in terms of pulling strategies, policies, programs together is because a lot of people have lost their rights. They're disenfranchised. Everything's happening in the centre, in Tarawa, in Majuro, in Suva, in Dili or whatever. And the way that people took decisions, the way the governance structures, not just participation, but transparency and accountability, was there before, at least in many of those islands. And it's been taken away by all this focus with money and technology in the center. So for me, the participation goes with the rights, but the way that you would then set it up has to be particular to the situation, to the issues that you're dealing with, and there are proven ways of structuring it, including having a very good facilitator such as Natasha. So we've got a job for you.
I think that this question also relates to the question about what aspects of culture we want to preserve. I think many of the cultures we might be thinking about for small communities have evolved under quite harsh circumstances where living is difficult, and giving up a lot of what we would think of as individual rights to the collective is a survival strategy. And when development changes that situation, the culture may have to evolve to acknowledge the idea that individual rights may be more important. I suspect that might relate to your people in the jungle, Butet.
Yeah, I think self-determination is come from a long process as well. It's about picking and throwing. Culture is always changing. It's a progress, and cultural identity also is always changing. It's whenever they think there's a threat into that, they sometimes have to throw something and then pick something, aspect of their culture. And self-determination is where they really have a independence and power to decide whenever or wherever they want to direct their life.
It's tricky though, isn't it? Because in reality, stuff just happens and we get on with our lives and it's busy, and we lose sense of what we're losing and what we're gaining in time.
But it can also be tricky if you see a cultural identity just based on attribute, or if you don't wear your traditional costume, then you're not Timorese enough, or you're not Indian enough. It's very tricky, and you cannot decide someone is not love their identity anymore just by saying that. It's very individual. It's very different one to another.
And a final comment to our ambassador.
I think rights is, number one is right as a human being, preserving the entity of a human being as such, whether it's man, woman, young, old. That is number one, right to exist as a human being. Then you come in terms of society, rights of society as a collective, rights of individual within that society. Can individual impose, because of his or her own right, impose some specific value that they dream of to impose on the society as a whole? So that's where you come into conflict and compromise. Yeah, and whether, because the culture does also evolve. Yeah, what is, for example, when we used to have warfare takes overnight, and in the morning they bring in the heads and dance, sunrise dance. And that has been abolished because there's no more warfare. So you don't dance the sunrise dance anymore. Yeah. But that is an evil practice, right? And that's a culture, but it's an evil practice that has been foregone. So there will be things that is, as a society evolve and accept, you know, what is the universal rights, right? You know, whether it's right to education, right to life, right to healthcare, right to education, right to how a human being exists within a society. You know, that's all that right. You know, and how you regulate that in terms of collectively by the government, by people you elect as a democracy. You know, sometimes, you know, democracy is a right to practice, you know, your views, you know, freedom of speech, and all these are all individual rights. But that has to be tempered with what is the right of, as a collective right? Yes. Can you impose your own views on the wider society? You cannot. Yes. If you do, you have trouble. Yeah. Or in democratically, if you elect a government that majority vote, in a democracy, majority always win. Majority vote always win. Whether wrong or right, they always win. And therefore, if they impose a law on the society, what the minority of those who had did not vote for the government, would they go into warfare with the government? Or they don't? Because because this government has been elected by the majority of the society, majority of the people. So those in minority follow, accept, even though they don't like, but they have to tolerate. They have to follow. I think that's, when you talk about rights, well, I think that's it.
Thank you very much indeed, and we got some great questions tonight. It's late, and you all need a drink, or a cup of tea, or some dinner, some sustenance. Thank you very much for being part of the conversation.
Yes.